So Joe, want to go first, or?
You then.
I'm happy to go. I don't think my little thing won't take very long at all. I really just wanted to kind of explain just very briefly about what is happening on August 13th. Members of STP who have met already, but I think that folks are kind of interested in others joining in on the effort, are going to speak with the Communist Caucus of the Democratic Socialists of America here in the US. And I sort of initiated kind of contact with STP as a member of the caucus, because I saw in a lot of the work that that STP was doing a sort of some tools for better understanding some of the problems that the caucus had been identifying in our organizing work. And I think that what's interested the STP in sort of collaborating with the caucus is that is the possibility of kind of figuring out how some of the sort of concepts and theoretical tools that the group has developed can apply to actual organizing contexts. So really what we're doing right now is I've been working with some STP folks to put together a presentation for the caucus. It's going to be about an hour long, and then there will be an hour of discussion and questions from caucus members. I don't know how much detail we need to, I'm not sure how much detail you guys want me to go into, but I think that the main thing is just making sure that anybody who might be interested in joining in on this effort, has a chance to do so. So just wanted to make sure people knew about it, and maybe folks can of course reach out to me, but also Gabriel and Dennis and others who are working on the presentation. And I'm fine with answering any questions that folks might have now as well.
Anyone has questions for Joe? Okay. We did write a short summary of what we spoke last time in our internal group, so there was already kind of an awareness of the whole thing. Perhaps that's also why.
As someone who's not going to the meetings, though, I'd like to say that this is very exciting. So I'd like to thank you a lot, Joe, for reaching out, because I think it's something I'm very curious for the developments, because I think this is like one of the main goals of the group. So I don't have any questions, but I think this is a good opportunity to say how this is very exciting for us, I think. As someone who's not going to the meetings, but has been following through the summaries and for what you said, and this is excellent.
Also, I think another thing we could say is that, it would be good to slowly already start kind of imagining what the next step could be in terms of having this Communist Caucus visit one of our meetings in the near future, and can be a very informal talk or something. Like, doesn't need to be like a really thought out thing, but it would be good also to try to keep some momentum after the 13th. We don't have anything scheduled for September, I think. So September on, or at least I think Vitor is scheduled for September. No, he's the last week of August. Bruno is scheduling something, but the date is not set yet. So we could definitely, open space in the near future.
Yeah, that sounds great. And yeah, thanks guys. I'll let you get on with your meeting, but yeah, looking forward to further working with y'all.
Yeah, I think someday hearing on the tenants work you guys have been doing, or even the labor stuff you mentioned that you've been starting on. We had like 2 weeks ago someone from Curitiba that presented on the, how do you say, like the housing occupations movements in the south of Brazil. Like, so that could also be a dialogue that would be interesting, because I'm not sure in Brazil tenants movement is yet a thing, right?
No.
I don't know why it hasn't, like under which conditions it emerged. So I think it would be very interesting to hear about it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the heads up, Renzo. I'm definitely gonna look at that. All right, guys, I gotta go, but have a good meeting and we'll talk soon.
See you, man.
Peace.
So everyone, I'd just like to give a heads up on the process. The process. This is like a reference for like the 3 people in this group who follow basketball. We have like a very high tick count. Where's John? Is John here? So we can do pin? No? Okay. So shout out to John. We currently have like more than half the people have ticked. There's still some people that have yet to tick. I will, as we've talked, the deadline was today. So I think we can, like, so tomorrow I'll give a summary of the process, of the results, and then we can finally kick off the transition period. We have currently 2 people who voted yes, Fernanda and Monica. And after we have the final results, we will start those other steps on the procedure that we decided upon. So very happy that we are getting on with this. Just a quick comment, won't keep long, but tomorrow I'll write a summary. Maybe not tomorrow because tomorrow is a long day, but definitely Wednesday I'll write a summary, but only ticks counted until today. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, Rafael, could you explain very briefly how it should go after this part? The transition and how the interest parts are going to be selected. I've seen the document, but I'd rather listen you explaining so I don't have any doubts.
Okay. Well, as we decided, the first part was, we had a discussion last week, I think. Yes, I'm sorry, I don't know what time is like anymore. We had a discussion last week, and what we had decided upon was that we would get like general suggestions for whoever the admin would be. So there were a few suggestions that we put on there's a link somewhere. I'll get it, but it's the link, I think, with the ideas on the process, on how the process is structured. And I think I can get this. Okay, I got this. So we have some suggestions. We had a really long discussion, I think, not very long, but about like what the person could do, what ideas. There was a moderating system, for example, that John proposed, but these ideas, they were not going to be something that would be bound to whoever the administrator would be. It's like suggestions, because as we've discovered, You mean the chart? No, it's not only the chart. I'll link just 1 second. It's this one. But the
Yeah, I
chart.
found the link there.
Okay, thanks, Gabriel. We talked about, for example, about getting an online meeting channel, and Gabriel was talking about, if I understood correctly, about the translation powers of Google Meets, right? So there's a lot of decisions to be made on how that could work. So that could be something that the future admin could look into. Besides the incumbency, the next steps that we aside from these proposals, the steps are the following. Just 1 second. The steps are the following. There would be this meeting there would be this meeting where we discuss the stuff. We'd also discussed in that meeting the time frame for the period. So I think we settled on, was it 3 months?
Yeah.
We settled on 3 months as a review period for the person who would be admin. And then after this review period, we would have a meeting, discuss, see what worked, what didn't, how can we continue from there. And then after the determination of that period, we did a negative lottery. That was all in last week's meeting. The lottery we actually held before because we wanted to start the meeting with a bit of a fun turning the wheels. And the lottery was, we would list the names of the people, everyone would be listed, and then people would have to say if they want to take the position or if they didn't want to take the position. We also decided in the meeting that if everyone said no, we would go over the names again with the idea that maybe people would be more well disposed or would be differently disposed depending on the results of the first one. After that, we settled on, like, as our current polls, a 1 week time for people to post if they want to participate or not, if they want to be the admin or not. And that was all what all the ticking was about. And as I've said in the group, it was also a very important measure, I think, of our an information about our capacity to make people participate, etc. So even people voting no, even people ticking no is very important information for us. And after that, after the selection, after the time frame for people to decide if they would take the position or no, we would have a period of transition. And this period of transition would be a period of transition that would be discussed with the person who would be the future CA. We would talk about, for example, how long they would need to get the position, to sort themselves out, what would they need, so they could consult the group to find out what tasks may need to be, so they can understand the process. And after this period of transition, we would start counting time frame. So this would be like decided beforehand. We would have a period of transition. And in the period of after the period of transition, we would start counting the 3 months. And then after the 3 months, we would have a review process of how it went, how it could go, how it should go, etc. That's what we decided upon until now. Great. So tomorrow we will start with the discussion of the transition, and then I think we could do that like in the org groups we have in one of the groups. And I think also part of the issue is the CA will also have to, go to the people. I think it's what's something that's good and easy is that since we have all those tasks, that lists of tasks, it won't be so hard. I think there is a lot of stuff that will come up during, this period, but it's something that I think will be very interesting, and I'm very curious for the review period. I think that's it. Any other questions? Sorry, Anda, for taking up the time also. Okay. So I think the floor is yours.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, should I just kick off? Sure. So I have like a couple of things that I should say beforehand. First is that I had to write everything down that I wanted to say because it's 11:30 where I am now. So I don't trust my brain at this hour to kind of not get bogged down in small details and whatnot. So my apologies if it's a little bit kind of formulaic. I'll try and extemporize a bit when I can. The second thing is that when I wrote everything down, it came out at about 30,000 words, which would take way too long. So I kind of frantically cut a lot of stuff out today, and I don't know what kind of state it's in. So hopefully it'll still cohere in some kind of way. But anyway, hopefully there'll be enough time for questions and everything at the end, and we can clarify some stuff that maybe was missing. And yeah, just the other thing is like, I'm going to be reading from a thing, so I won't see if people are telling me that I'm speaking too quickly or just like if I'm taking too much time. So people should just give me a shout if they're like, we would like to move to a discussion now, or like, can you please slow down and everything else. So hopefully that's all okay with everybody. There's also no slides because I'm not really good at slides. So yeah. So I didn't really want to give people like an overly simplistic sort of account of transformative justice, because I'm going to kind of say that I'd imagine like people have an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about transformative justice. But I would say like, yeah, I'm going to give it like a little bit of a description and more specifically of the work that I've been doing politically, like within a kind of, yeah, within this context of transformative justice. I guess like the main sort of outlook for me is that my own thinking about transformative justice is that I do think that this is kind of a model of justice that can in principle be generalized. And I would say like that we should try to generalize it as a political project. So that's kind of what this presentation is supposed to be about. As it currently stands, I think transformative justice is something that only really pertains to the level of the community or like the organizational level with some quite strict parameters. And I kind of want to ask, you know, what would it take to kind of instantiate the ethos of transformative justice within institutions of justice that would be designed to address more general social problems. And this question kind of entails a return to first principles, which means asking ourselves, like, what exactly do we mean by transformative? What do we mean by justice in a more general sense than the one like that we currently kind of realize in political practice? So by discussing this kind of practice, I want to also try and isolate some general features of transformative justice such that when we're thinking about it, we can sort of not just identify these specific practices, but maybe try and stipulate something more general. So the way I kind of wanted to start this presentation was by talking about transformative justice and its relationship to like the idea of care. And this is kind of going back again to like the way that this is sort of motivated by what I'm doing in my own political practice. So how I got involved in this work was that I started working for a group within my organization that's called the Care and Justice Working Group. And so these are all my own reflections. They're not like something that we've discussed at length in that group. But I did start to become interested in this topic and presenting it to STP because I actually began working on another case, like a kind of a sort of very easygoing, I would say, relatively accountability process around the same time that I started coming to STP and coming to meetings. And I think both of those events for me have been like sort of mutually informative in quite interesting ways. So I'd like to say that, you know, like, especially like some of the stuff around like the modes of exchange and the stuff that STP has been reading through Karatani has been quite interesting. And I guess I'll go through some of that in the presentation. So yeah, I would say like, it's also kind of a longstanding political conviction for me, like since I've become involved with organized politics, like, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, really, has been like, just general questions around organizational reproduction, social reproduction, and sort of organizational thinking in general. I think they are connected in various kind of ways, in a way that, you know, they're not all the same thing, but they're kind of connected in the sense of like, what does it take to reproduce an organization or a society? Like these kinds of questions are connected in that way. So I think they become like particularly important to analyze together when we do start to think about the question of care. And I don't think that it's like accidental that this working group that I'm part of relates these questions of care and justice together. I think a transformative understanding of justice like necessitates that we connect it to like a very expanded sense of care. So justice isn't a matter of just like what morally and socially relevant pronouncements are made about something that happens, but crucially about like the kind of measures that need to be taken constructively to constructively work through what is taken place. So a proviso kind of needs to be added here, which I want to kind of disabuse some of the typical responses about care that one can sometimes encounter, which I think are kind of symptomatic of some broader political issues. Often care is kind of treated as this sort of fluffy concept that, you know, it's kind of an ancillary issue to the real politics and the more substantive sort of side of human relations or whatever. And I think that the fact that it is can be largely put down to like some ideological stuff about the role that like particularly women play in society, since care work has always been sort of socialized to be like the duty and responsibility of women, especially in like the modern history of patriarchal societies. I would say like the residual effects of this still play out in like large, you know, social relations, writ large and sort of organizational level. But this isn't really about like the social relations aspect of it, because I think there's other people who've maybe pointed this out better than I'll be able to do here. I just kind of wanted to flag this like unseriousness of the concept of care, that it sort of makes it something that like is already assumed as like the underlying conditions that exist. So it never gets kind of explicated in important ways. So yeah, I think it's like to some extent political organizations have been doing this and have done it, but I think it's still something that hasn't been fully resolved. And I'd say, yeah, just like that's kind of why I wanted to bring this up here. So I think we should be thinking about care relations also in terms of like the modes of exchange. I feel like one effect that we sometimes see is that care is something kind of devalued and implicit in societies demarcates a point where mode A type social relations are stretched to a sort of breaking point to cover the contradictions and excesses of state and capitalist relations. And this brings me to the most important point that I wanted to make in relation to care, which was that we shouldn't only be thinking in terms of like these kind of intimate and effective non-scalable terms. I think we actually, in fact, like as soon as we start to look at the care industry and understand that it isn't possible to sort of rely on the usual effective mechanisms that adequate levels of care are sort of provided, and the fact that this kind of still remains an underlying assumption at the social level informs a lot of interesting phenomena that gets us back to the question of justice. So like one thing that I'm quite interested in, which I haven't really gone into like any sort of like deeper level of research, but you know, would like to at some point, is even like thinking about some of the kind of psychopathologies that seem to attend like industrial care work and also care work in general. Like in the extreme limit, you have things like, you know, nurses and doctors like harming patients, but then like more common still, you find like abuse in care homes and so on. I think it's like quite significant both that these seem to have like specific pathologies to like a specific kind of industrial context. And also I think what was quite interesting is like how, you know, like the general public reserves its very worst condemnation for these instances of abuse. I think it is definitely kind of connected to like, you know, it has to be connected in some way to like the demands of labor and the conditions of alienation, as well as the fact that there's just this enormous and sort of unbridgeable gulf between what it means to care for individuals that you have some direct and sort of filial social responsibility towards, and on the other hand, to do care work in the domain of civil society, where like, you know, the question of obligation involves a set of different kind of tensions and contradictions between social good and participation in a sort of wider, more abstract sense of community, economic relations, etc. So like similarly, I think maybe the public reaction also tells us something about this, like, you know, maybe there's like a certain kind of underlying paranoia, etc. Again, it's something that I haven't really gone into in a huge amount of detail, but I thought it was just like worth bringing up here is sort of underlying what kind of motivates some of my thinking about this. So like, yeah, when the main point I kind of wanted to raise is like the topic, and with respect to this topic of care, was like the mediation of social relations, and we find that it pretty quickly presents the kind of problem, like a kind of structural problem that is largely invisible. So there's like a real lack of theoretical adequate sort of practical vocabularies and affordances that would allow us to think of care beyond this very immediate level of human experience. And I think that that's directly connected to transformative justice, insofar as we're talking here about a model of justice that kind of emphasizes the aspect of care for those involved in the process, and tries to also think about the continuity of social relations as they're affected not only by kind of what happens to warrant a process, but also like, you know, how the process itself works. So by this, I kind of mean that any sort of transformative approach to justice, you don't really have this, you know, separation of the verdict and the concrete sort of consequences of that verdict. So like whereas a judge can sort of impose a statutory penalty and, you know, kind of never have to really think about whether prisons are effective ways of reducing overall crime rates, or whether like, you know, how it benefits the plaintiff or whatever. A transformative justice like process necessarily kind of involves like a longer term commitment, longer term institutional support, and by this kind of extension to this, like, you know, a commitment to deeper thinking about care, about like how different parties kind of don't have to just fend for themselves and like fall back on like the existing sort of support structures, but rather to make those support structures kind of explicit and sort of develop them where necessary, where we find gaps and so on. So that was kind of like, I kind of wanted to open it with care, but you know, this is kind of more of a background thing that like maybe we'll come back to it in the discussion. So then I was kind of thinking also like, maybe we can think about this in terms of like justice and like the nomos of the society. So I guess when we're trying to connect these ideas to the question of political revolution, this would involve overturning not only like the prevailing ideas of justice, but also the institutions that subtend them. And then of course, I'm not thinking here along the lines that we have like first a revolution and then somehow we try to reform the entire social and institutional character of justice. It's more that the revolution itself depends on our ability to do this, or consists in a kind of transformation of those institutions by way of their determinate negation. As part of this, I also want to suggest that there are questions that pertain also to like social institutions in general, and not just to the kind of typical ones that we think about when we're thinking about legal institutions. But I would say, like, to distinguish a bit from political philosophy and sort of the enterprise of developing a theory of justice, this is really more about like transforming social institutions themselves in a way that's kind of more functional with respect to justice, and which is why I kind of wanted to frame this discussion in terms of social metabolism and not just norms. So the way that this can encompass, like, for instance, schools or care homes or families, etc., might be thought of more in terms of like the ensemble, in the sense that, like, Simondon proposes in his account of the development of technical objects, whereby we go from like levels of abstraction with respect to individual institutions to a more concrete understanding which sees institutions in the context of this kind of technical ensemble where they work together. So viewed in the latter sense, then the various institutions of society can be evaluated in terms of how well they're synchronized with their proximate institutions and processes as part of a social totality. So when we're talking about transformative justice, I think on the one hand, I do want to say that we're talking about a very specific set of institutions or possible institutions and processes, but then in an expanded sense, these only work effectively when they're considered to be part of an ensemble of social relations, and how this ensemble itself integrates the model of transformative justice is not an incidental matter, but very much fundamental to the realization of a transformative model. In terms of the challenge that this presents for any revolutionary project, I do think that Carl Schmitt was generally correct here in his analysis that the legal sphere is subtended by a nomos, and this concept of nomos is extended and analyzed in its sociological, philosophical, political, historical dimensions. It can't be sort of treated as something so easily fungible or kind of accidental to the possibility of revolution. So, like, political revolution itself entails a kind of transformation of the underlying nomos of a society, which is codified in the institutions of a state or political territory, but in such a way that these kind of mutually presuppose each other, namely like the institutions and the underlying nomos. So the nomos preconditions and reinforces that social order, and shouldn't only be understood as something kind of made possible by it. So when we're talking about transformative justice, I think we're also talking about overcoming and overturning some deeply entrenched social and juridical norms. And transformative justice involves in many ways a transformation of those very norms as part of its critical diagnosis of prevailing models of justice. And again, I think when we're wanting to think about transformative justice in this more general sense, this is kind of what I really mean, like namely a political project that entails the transformation of the nomos of a given society as like that nomos is instantiated institutionally and structurally. So the project of transformative justice is really broad in that it involves a certain kind of overturning of path dependencies. And this is like a transformation of institutions, but also maybe like the psychological needs that those institutions create and respond to. A mix of, you know, the kinds of sociality that those institutions create, the ways in which they reproduce the prevailing sort of different mix of different modes of social exchange in a society. And hopefully like this is kind of a little bit clear, at least in terms of like how it connects to what STP is in like analyzing in terms of like modes of exchange and so on. So I guess like this is a little bit more abstract. So to kind of say a bit about transformative justice in practice, like I'll try and be a bit more specific about how this kind of relates to my own political practice. But again, like this is quite a broad topic. So maybe my concern is a little bit more in the general case, but hopefully it's clear how they're both connected. So like terms like transformative justice, restorative justice, etc., are used in very similar ways to mean the development of processes and techniques to address matters of justice without recourse to the typical carceral and punitive sort of models of state justice. I personally prefer the idea of transformative justice because the term restorative sometimes seems to imply the obviousness of something to be restored, whereas I think what we are trying to achieve politically with such processes entails a kind of intervention that doesn't restore some unmolested state of social relations, but rather which transforms them in a more constitutive way. I think the formulation of transformative also entails a kind of open-endedness, which is quite important to my own thinking about how this can be conceived more generally on the level of society, rather than in this kind of specific community practices that this concept currently entails. So there's, of course, like other interpretations of restoration, which might be valid in this context. Like, for example, we're thinking about the restoration of like the integrity of the person that's been harmed or whatever. But I think these can be sort of encompassed within the idea of transformative justice also. So I tend to prefer that term. There's not really a canonical image of what these transformative justice processes do look like or entail, but I'd say there's maybe like 4 things I think in common that like to most, if not all, transformative justice kind of approaches. Firstly, I think a really big thing is that the objectives are to reach a holistic resolution, by which I mean like both care for and safety of the harmed individual, and in a certain way also the perpetrator of like a kind of some sort of like dispute or a crime or like accusation or something like this are both important. And I think also like holistic here can also kind of encompass treating like the general conditions or like what led to this happening and so on. And so whilst this means that as much as possible, we try and care about the mental and physical well-being of both sides in a sort of dispute or multiple sides. We also think that this, I would say this also looks quite different depending on the context for either party, and what you need to do really depends on like how you understand care in this kind of like expanded sense. So one of the most difficult things in practice that, you know, can be to like navigate between the different kinds of demands that doing both care and justice entails, where there's kind of sometimes a trade-off between the two. And particularly when we consider like some conventional interpersonal cases, like justice for one person might mean, in some superficial sense at least, neglecting the care of the other, and the inverse might just as easily apply. So as I've already mentioned, I think it is really important for us to try and deepen our understanding of care to mean something more than like this terms like radical empathy or like acquiescence to what people express as being their interests. And this, you know, this often means making kind of difficult decisions, or like it implies a sort of moral hazard on the person that discharges a responsibility in relation to care. So I would say there's like quite a lot of things that actually aren't adequately described as care, but they tend to somehow get lumped in with that concept. You know, there's a lot of things that can be good and make people happy and improve their lives in some way. And I'm not saying that those things should always be discouraged either, but I think they can sort of muddy our concept of what care is. So maybe one way that we can make a salient distinction is that there's a distinction of like caring about somebody, which is kind of more voluntaristic, and like you can kind of say it without really acting on it in some meaningful way. And then on the other hand, you have caring for, which I think does imply a sort of like a responsibility that is non-voluntaristic. And that also, I think, opens up a space for us to think, you know, maybe this doesn't always work on an individual basis, and maybe there's like social conditions that need to be satisfied in order to satisfy the kind of care for case. So, okay, second common feature, I think, is that these tend to try and avoid punishment and related sort of carceral concepts of justice. And like what punishment means, typically it's like, it doesn't mean, you know, that a person isn't going to like be, you know, disappointed in some way, but it does mean that there is kind of like, you know, we're not trying to specifically punish people in order to get a certain kind of reaction that punishing typically tends to provoke, or satisfy a certain kind of need that punishment often provokes for the person that metes out the punishment. So one thing that I think is really difficult here is that no transformative justice should really be in the game of trying to promise a full restoration of social relations. And so like whether someone actually recovers from some harm or abuse that they've suffered to the point that they're willing to like forgive that person or allow them to be in like close proximity, etc., is a very contingent question. It's not at all guaranteed by any transformative justice process. And sometimes I think that these processes have been abused to the extent that like they're seen as offering this kind of guarantee. They're seen as kind of maybe trying to give like, you know, this 100% success rate, like that we almost sometimes prioritize the sort of people that have done some form of harm or whatever. Again, I think like, I don't like the term restorative justice precisely because it can mislead in implying this. I think processes are transformative because they can still transform relations, make things much better than they would otherwise be, than the comparable alternative. But this better has to be sort of better given that something bad has happened, and not as if it hadn't happened. So I think that it's, you know, I don't think it's realistic to expect of any model of justice that it can somehow wipe away the slate of history of what people have actually done or been subjected to. And I would say it's actually a massive failure of any leftist approach to justice wherever things have been approached in this kind of a way. And I think that's quite a hard thing for people to accept sometimes. Like once you've done serious harm to somebody, you can't expect your life to sort of continue as it was before, just as like the person that has had something done to them probably won't be the same, even if they can be better or worse as a result of how that is handled. So I think this is something, unfortunately, that there's like sometimes botched sort of transformative justice processes that maybe evade some of this kind of like more difficult issues, and with the consequence that like those people who've like suffered one time are condemned to suffer kind of a second injury. You know, like this is also true when you just look at sort of conventional justice, and particularly the way in which like racist and classist institutions tend to punish people from like, you know, like subaltern sort of backgrounds or whatever, more harshly because they don't have any qualms about like enforcing the idea that a sort of lapse or failure should have a lasting and consequential effect on a person's life. Whereas like if it's a rich person, like they say things like, oh, well, they've got their whole life ahead of them, so we're going to be more lenient with the sentencing. So like obviously I think it's a big challenge for things like transformative justice not to kind of reproduce that, and at the same time to sort of avoid the other issue, which would be like excessive punishment and a kind of satisfying the desire for punishment in a way. Which I think is also like something that I'll talk about a little bit in a while. So the third distinctive feature of these processes is that they're typically only realized on a small scale within existing communities. Again, this is something that's going to be like I'll go into a lot more detail on in a while. I mean, I understand it as being like this kind of takes place within a kind of predominantly mode A type relation, and it has a kind of form of power that is invested in the community sort of. Like, yeah, so it kind of pretty much like exclusively relies upon reciprocal exchange, and maybe like we can understand carceral sort of state justice as like a mode B type relation. I'm kind of curious also, like, I mean, I'm not really well read in Karatani. It's kind of something that I'm getting to more than like really competent. I understand maybe the basics. What I was quite interested in is like, where Karatani talks about like mode D relations as having this kind of like higher dimensional reinstatement of mode A type relations. And, you know, maybe that kind of maps onto what my project is about here in terms of like generalizing something that only seems to work at the community level as it currently stands to a kind of, yeah, like a higher dimension, right? Like a more, like taking it from the level of community and applying it to the level of society. But I would be like interested to hear people's thoughts on that, because I'm not, you know, somebody that has really fully gone into the weeds with Karatani. So then that like brings the fourth common feature of these processes, which is that they sometimes, like I think pretty much always actually depend on like participation and compliance. They don't have any sort of violence to enforce their demands. That doesn't mean that they don't have some form of coercion. I think that they usually do. Like, you know, if you don't participate, like you might then not be able to continue participating in like a certain community or a certain political organization and so on. But I would say like that is still a less constrained choice and a very much weaker form of coercion than like the kind of coercion that the law normally uses, especially when we're thinking about political organizations where people aren't just like their identity is and their sort of social world is not completely subsumed by that kind of world. So okay, like the next thing to kind of talk about is that I think a lot of these processes and a lot of this thinking has kind of become a lot more popularized and sort of developed in recent years, especially with this kind of like canceling stuff or like people being like socially exiled and so on. So there's like no way for us not to kind of talk about that. I think the territory is like super dicey, so I'm inclined to avoid like talking about cancel culture. I think that this is like quite a bloated term, and often it's kind of used in very sort of motivated ways, which doesn't really point to like some underlying problems, which, you know, some of them are real, some of them are kind of I don't know, like kind of like imagined. I think my main contention is more about like the concrete things that underlie some of that. So one of them would be like things like public denunciation, like something like punishment being, you know, like calling somebody out in a very sort of visible way to shame them. And so like transformative justice is a good sort of alternative to that. So my main contention when it comes to public denunciation is that I feel like punishment is more about the one who metes out the punishment than it is about the one who's being punished. And I would say in a sense that this kind of satisfies a set of psychic needs and things that we shouldn't be afraid to address critically in that sense. I think it's especially important to add here that as soon as we start to talk about processes and social power and not just the kind of immediate reactions that individuals have to things that have happened to them personally, we're actually really talking more about social kind of complexes and relations. We're kind of talking about also like a lot of the time third parties. We're not talking about individuals who've been personally harmed so much as like the people who then kind of come around to advocate for them or support them, and how they sort of try to do that and like, you know, on behalf of another person. So I think what transformative justice processes try to do is take on a kind of mediative role, so that we'll kind of cut out this kind of like outraged third-party advocate, because I think that the role that these third-party advocates often play in these cases is rarely helpful to people, and it's often actively harmful. And I think it automatically follows that as soon as we're talking about justice, we're really talking about kind of mediation, which is also like always necessary, right? Because we don't want people who have been like harmed by somebody to be the person that also has to sort of seek redress for that personally, right? Like we always want there to be some form of mediation. I think that often when people do try and step in and fight for the survivor on their behalf, you know, I don't want to be uncharitable about that. I do think that people often sort of have good intentions, but I do also think that the consequences are often bad, and maybe sometimes also like we should still question like why people are motivated in a way to become especially like militant about this in ways that are like not really conducive to a healthy process and to like satisfying the care and the needs of the individuals concerned. So I would say in many cases, like actually when a person has been harmed in a significant way, like we get this thing where like actually I think it is really important for that person to become extremely angry and to express that anger without reservation, like probably actually is part of this kind of like, maybe, I don't know if this is the correct use of the term, but like an abreactive kind of process that allows them to deal with this sort of trauma of what's happened, or like ameliorate some of the suffering. So I feel like this is like kind of thing where people need to be able to like use the hyperbole of like, I want to kill this person, but specifically in a way that it's not actually going to be acted out upon. And I think this is kind of why we need to have this mediating role, like, or one of the really important reasons. And I think, you know, like there's a lot of reasons why we need to also see justice as specifically not acting upon what people say in these contexts. Like they shouldn't be taken as indications of what is the best thing to do to help that person. Like often being able to just express this bilious sort of hatred towards somebody that's wronged you is like itself the primary need, or like one very important need in that moment. So, you know, I mean, I'm putting that out there. I could be wrong about that. I would definitely like to hear people's opinions, but I do think that like this is a really important role that friends and comrades can play to a person, is to just kind of create this envelope of space where they can express like obviously I think that this is not totally the case. Also, I think there are things that people express as needs that like are things that we need to take into account, right? Like this is, you know, it's really a question of like how we navigate those things. But I think one of the problems that we've seen quite often is, you know, people do tend to take that sort of outrage and translate it in a very direct way into like a form of action that would be an effective mode of redress. And I think that actually, there's a lot of problems with this in terms of, you know, it might cause that person who expresses this to start to repress certain feelings because they're worried that, you know, if they express things too dramatically, then like that has a very serious moral consequence for them. You know, like, yeah, it might imply sort of moral hazard down the line. It might imply a sort of regret that doesn't allow them to fully process what's happened and so on. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but this is kind of like some of why I think it's quite important to like have these processes that in this very specific mediative role and how it connects back to the question of care. Yeah, I think there's also like this kind of question comes up in how we think about the history of the left and the left kind of sort of approach to like interpersonal specifically, but also in general justice. I think it's actually kind of a little bit of an issue for the left historically. I don't want to say that like what people are doing now with canceling is like even comparable to like, you know, some sort of public denunciation or excessively punitive stuff like show trials or whatever, but I do think that maybe they satisfy like similar drives, and I think that that's something that we also need to think about as leftists, right? So like, I don't think that this in any meaningful way, these kind of things serve the ends of justice. Often they're harmful to all parties. They're detrimental to the broader social relations also, which I think is really important. So I think it's, you know, important to bridge between where like these specific cases also connect up to social relations writ large. So basically where this transformative component can not only can, but in a sense has to underlie our ideas of what a revolutionary society looks like. And on the most fundamental level, what we're trying to navigate is the basic inevitability that people will do bad things to each other in any kind of society. And you know, that no matter how much we try to improve social conditions will and reduce the rate at which people do harm to each other through acts of violence and abuse, there'll always be some kind of remainder that, you know, isn't just attributable to social and economic conditions. So yeah, I mean, I think I've lost the thread slightly because I think I deleted the big paragraph here. It's kind of gone off. But okay, I'm gonna skip a little bit because I know it's kind of it's already quite long. Okay, so I think that there is like quite a large amount of political value to be gained by thinking about how we can get people to sort of persist with a process in which they stand to be accused of something, and you know, the way in which I think a lot of people are kind of socially conditioned by conventional models of justice and disciplinary protocols creates this kind of anxiety that any admission of guilt is going to be eternalized and lead to like very strict forms of punishment and so on, and that our integrity in some more spiritual sense is in jeopardy as soon as we sort of concede that we've done some sort of wrong. And so I suppose also like an important aspect of what transformative justice processes try to do is overturn some of these assumptions and then transform sociality or present some kinds of like practical framework for doing it in the process as well. So I've tried to like reflect on my own personal interest with this stuff also. Like, I think it's not incidental for me that like I'm coming from a country with like quite a recent history of very totalizing social discipline enforced by the Catholic Church and state complex, right? So I'm from Ireland in case it's not apparent, but yeah, this is like something that probably has quite a personal component for me. And I would say like that kind of social conditioning was directly experienced by my parents' generation. But I think it's interesting also that even though it was sort of relaxed in the sense that the church began to become like less prominent in society as I was growing up, some of those sort of structures, psychological structures and social structures became sort of reinstituted in new institutions. And so I think like this kind of shows something quite important about how like residual social effects and kind of norms and the kind of nomos that underlies justice can be kind of reinstituted in new institutions. And so I think something that I find really interesting is reading like Marcuse on this point, who kind of talks about like how you have like these kind of psychic factors to kind of that have like continuing social effects. So he talks about like the persistence of this psychic thermidor, like this kind of nagging persistence of things that kind of reinstitutes itself in new institutions. And so like where the need still exists, like this can result in the ascension of another sort of institution to satisfy the same or a similar kind of social need. So when we're talking about transformative justice in relation to institutions, I think it's really, really important that we try to understand like that actually replacing the institutions is not in itself enough, but that we need to replace the institutions in a way that also kind of negates certain kinds of psychic and social dependencies, whereby this political act of negation qualitatively determines the character of the new or transformed institutions that we want to produce. So I appreciate that this has been like a little bit sprawling so far. And for me, like the next sort of concluding thing that I want to do, although it's a long conclusion, so hopefully people are not too bored yet. But I want to try and you know, say something about how these specific practices and the issues surrounding them can be connected to a more general idea of transformative justice and the revolutionary promise that I think transformative justice still does contain. So the way I want to frame this is like in terms of a critique of the communitarian model, which I think is, you know, explicitly or implicitly underlies the ideas that people tend to have when it comes to thinking about revolutionary potentials of transformative justice. I also want to highlight some cases where I think that questions of justice can't really be handled at the community level at all, but where we might still want to think about this in terms of a transformative model. And there's going to be a lot that I don't capture in this because it's a very broad topic, but I think that's fine because I really just kind of want to inaugurate this as a problematic through which we can continue to think about various relevant questions and issues. So some caveats on that. I think probably not everybody that's interested in or an advocate of transformative justice has a clearly like revolutionary project in mind. I mean, it's just a consequence of the fact that this stuff is being co-opted in a lot of places that, you know, it's just kind of also sometimes just satisfying like a liberal sort of social progressivism. So probably there's a lot of people that don't have any sort of revolutionary project in mind. But you know, I think that there's equally quite a few people that do have a revolutionary sort of outlook when it comes to transformative justice, and transformative in the sense that we also transform those institutions of justice. So I think also within that, maybe we can also say that there's two positions. One of them is to say that like there are people who think that we can sort of have like a political revolution that has a heavy sort of component of transformative justice that in some sense relies on the way that it currently exists in practices that tend to mostly be on the level of communities. And then I think you can have maybe an alternative view, which is the one that I take, which is that obviously there's still an important communitarian component, but we need to sort of generalize this to the level of society and social institutions. And within that, there's like a lot of nuance. But I think when you construct these ideal typologies and force people to, you know, into a position of identifying with one position or another, or not identifying and trying to locate themselves on a spectrum, this can be really constructive also. So yeah, in any case, I think there's definitely a political tendency whereby the basic unit of political life in society is the community, and everything else revolves around communities. And even where you have a complicated system of integrating those communities and so on, there is a sort of relative autonomy of each community or a local structure such that it can facilitate the maximum amount of self-determination by individuals as members of the community. And so I think the emphasis on these kind of cases really needs to be laid upon the extent to which individual subjects are constituted in relationship to their community and not to some wider political reality or mode of exchange, such as the state or capital, or maybe in a more positive sense like humanity or social world or something like this. Owing to the fact that community seems to provide a robust alternative to these other systems that subjectivate individuals in ways that often prove exploitative and alienating, there is a strong tendency, I think, towards communitarian models, especially within like certain kind of conventional like anarchist politics or something like this. And at the same time, I think that you can see how this model structurally affords greater power to individuals. So individuals vis-a-vis the state or capital are typically sort of just obliterated by sheer scale. And I think the communitarian urge lies with the fact that individuals become much less abstract relative to community. So another way of putting it is that community offers a scale of resolution in which power, influence, and significance of an individual with respect to their social world is much more tractable to everyday phenomenal experience. And this, I think, also might be part of the turn to this kind of parochial or smaller scale model of sociality that we see with people like Agamben and maybe also Bifo. I think the Aurora Apolito, this critique of Bifo is really instrumental to my thinking on this issue. You know, I think that the individual does just exist at this kind of higher resolution at the level of community. And by extension, when what we typically consider to be meaningful with respect to the experiential dimension of human life is mostly located within this context, which is why I think Agamben can quite easily extend his homo sacer notion to like things like a critique of large-scale epidemiology and anti-contagion measures, right? Because at this scale of resolution, individuals are definitely being understood as like their lives in quite a statistical way, and necessarily so. But I think this also kind of illustrates where the urge to want to think about justice at a larger scale for me kind of plays out. So what I think people believe when it comes to this revolutionary project of transformative justice is that if we return to like an emphasis on communities as the basic social unit and then adopt a transformative model of justice wherein individuals are kind of reformed and cared for by the community, which should have both like all the resources and also the responsibility to provide this kind of process and the care that goes with it, then we can subsequently transform justice in a more general sense, meaning we eliminate the need for prisons, punishment, etc. And at the same time, we address many of the preconditions, such as the aforementioned sort of lack of adequate care that can lead to the need for judicial proceedings in the first place. Actually, I think I might have cut out the section where I talked a little bit about that. But basically, the idea is that when we're thinking about also institutions of care, we're talking about like what prevents the need for like more and more kind of criminal sort of like judicial system and criminalization and so on. So yeah, to put my own cards on the table, I think it's already kind of obvious where I stand on this. I don't think that like just thinking on the level of communities is a coherent political project. And even to the extent that it could be, I would say it is an undesirable project for me. So by this, I don't mean that I think that there would be no role for communities within some kind of revolutionary project of informing our basic sort of conception and institutions of justice. I'd say it's like a necessary but insufficient condition. So I think a starting assumption, given where we are and what kinds of needs any revolutionary project would need to satisfy, is that we can't entirely fall back upon community structures to fulfill some of the most fundamental functions that we ought to expect of justice. I think that there's like an unfortunate degree of naivete that is betrayed by what I feel is a tendency to regress to societies that are characterized predominantly by this kind of mode A type exchange as the primary locus of justice, which is not really realistic with respect to the kinds of real problems that a theory of justice does need to address, or like a political sort of revolutionary approach to justice needs to address rather. And I would say, like, with respect to the material conditions and complex social relations that characterize our current sort of conjuncture, which is planetary, I think, in scale and has to be conceived in that way. I do think that transformative justice actually can be thoroughly implemented in something like a community sorry, I think that if we try to only do it in this kind of community substrate, we fail to make this leap to sort of a higher dimensionality that I think also I find interesting in Karatani and like what he's writing about. So yeah, I think that there's definitely like just clearly also a difference in political horizon between the position that I want to espouse here and maybe the more communitarian perspective. I think that these different sort of resolutions of scale do need to be made intelligible at the level of sort of social experience or like individual experience to the best extent that that can be done. But I think that that's a very different kind of political demand to the one that just wants the social ontology to regress back into this kind of more immediate and primitive form. So I do think we need like epidemiology, like knowledge sharing on technologies that are vital for the reproduction and flourishing of human life. And I think that these are matters of justice, as are issues surrounding like the withholding of patents for like really vital life-saving drugs and their pricing and so on. So I think that these are questions of justice that can't be resolved within the jurisdiction of communities, and the questions surrounding their transformation can't simply be understood as a matter of individuals being transformed, but rather structural conditions have to be transformed. And I think this is definitely the point where it becomes harder to see how the general idea about justice is connected to some of the things I was talking about earlier in terms of transformative justice in its current practice. So I do want to try and deal with this kind of gap here, which, you know, I don't know how well I've done it, but we can discuss that. But basically my idea is that really what this means is maybe like translating the ethos of these practices into some more general kind of social form. So in one way, I think there are just like practical and logistical issues that do come with scale, and the fact that deferring to communities rather than thinking in terms of societies and social institutions does like impose some very steep limitations. I've intimated a couple of these. One really profound one is that when you do actually, even on the community level, try to like run accountability processes properly, it's like just really, really time consuming. It has a really heavy individual commitment. And I don't actually think that this is really sustainable or desirable. I think that we can, you know, sure, we can like prefigure what we would want to see in the world by doing it all ourselves as like a handful of individuals. But in a way, I think this actually kind of maps on to like some of the differences between what it means to think organizationally versus individually. Like, you know, as individuals, we can cut through a lot of complexity and nuance because we can treat everything in this kind of super context sensitive way and just like use the unexplicated computational power of individual brains to like deal with all of this nuance and handle it. But then we're kind of limited to a really finite number of questions that kind of pertain to a subjective individual experience. And also just like on a very practical level, I think that the number of cases that are addressable by willing individuals, or the number of cases that we would need to like deal with in sort of social justice context is just like way more than what would be addressable by like willing individuals or so on. So I think we really need to think about sort of economies of scale, infrastructural affordances that come with thinking only at the level of societies rather than communities. So I think that that does, again, come back to this question about like how all the different institutions of a society function in some kind of synchronized way. How are they better composed as a concrete ensemble and less as kind of abstract individual components? And as things currently stand, I think that what very often happens is that individuals running a single process on the community level end up just kind of integrating a lot of different tasks into a single task. So like we run a process, we ensure that everybody has adequate levels of care and support, we delegate these as required, we follow up with individuals and so on. And even here we like run into a lot of limitations that maybe we could surpass if we started to think on the level of institutions and the kind of, yeah, general social relations rather than like this kind of smaller scale that we're currently only able to practice it on. And of course, this is like a huge political project, like how do we realize that? So I think that there's like many important terrains also relevant to justice that I think can't just be made intelligible to this sort of communitarian perspective, like ranging from historical injustices to like questions surrounding reparations, to climate justice, accountability for individual, like, or for like environmental degradation, things like this. Like, I think, you know, obviously there's a sense in which, like, if people know like the general idea behind transformative justice, like there's a kind of maybe something slightly off about thinking about a transformative justice approach to like war crimes, right? Like, I don't think that transformative justice, but I think that that's what misguided, right? But I do think that like when we want to talk about transformative justice in relation to like these bigger issues, like I don't think it means like setting up an accountability pod for like Ratko Mladic to like deal with like, you know, the like former war crimes in like Serbia or whatever, or Yugoslavia. But like I do think that maybe like also when we look at the kind of existing like juridical sort of systems that we have to deal with this, or like affordances, also these aren't particularly effective. And we can see this by the fact that like the social situations like largely haven't been well transformed. We still see like a lot of things it's like recurring, right? Like we never transform the situation. We've kind of just held an individual accountable in a sense. Okay, so I want to kind of rush through the last because I know I've been talking for a long time. So then I want to sort of talk a little bit about like why I wanted to call this metabolism rather than just kind of norms. So again, like I think when we're talking about transformative justice, we are talking about like what would it take to transform the material and social conditions, and not just to kind of institute certain norms. So I want to really briefly digress here to just like make clear how I'm understanding metabolism, and I would say also like second nature, because I guess like I'm inheriting, or like the sort of stuff that I'm reading through more is like influenced by this kind of humanist position of Hegel, and especially the later developments of like early Marx, the developments to Hegel's kind of account of life and its relationship to genus being or whatever, and which is like genus being is sometimes translated as species being, but I think I'm convinced that genus being is better, but I'm not going to get bogged down in this. I think this is like a esoteric kind of thing. But yeah, so I think, and this maybe also connects to Karatani when he's talking about the modi as being this kind of like either secular or religious undergirding of social relations. I think also maybe Gatton's sort of genus concepts kind of maybe, or like thinking about human species or something can provide a similar kind of grounding. So yeah, I mean, I kind of just want to go through like a few small points on this. And hopefully just to like illuminate my own understanding of like where, like how I'm treating this question of metabolism and second nature. So basically I do feel like I'm on board with Karatani and his sort of general outlook as I understand it, but I think I tend to find something like thinking about the internal purposiveness of a genus being, or like human beings, as a kind of objective grounding for value claims as a better candidate for this sort of objective grounding than a sort of categorical imperative. And I think especially when it comes to the idea of thinking about and revising the kinds of institutions that we have, I think that this can be quite compelling to think about it in terms of taking life as an object for conscious reflection and somehow determining the institutions or the social relations that we have with respect to what might be the conditions for like human reproduction, human self-actualization, flourishing, and so on. So I think that Marx's account of genus being is famously connected to his theory of alienation. And in his earlier writings in particular, this is articulated as the alienation of human production and activity from its genus character, through which we take life as the object of our conscious reflection and determination. In fact, even in the state of alienation, we can understand human productive activity and the production of commodities as a kind of sublimated expression of our genus being. But it's a kind of activity here with which reduces genus being in a way that it becomes a mere instrument from which we're separated. So in a sense where Marx explicates the notion of things like free conscious activity, it entails a type of productive activity. And maybe we can also conceive of exchange under similar categories in terms of grounding of that activity as it pertains to things like needs, self-fulfillment, self-actualization, and so on. So I think also, unlike Hegel, for Marx, the idea of species is characterized as having a social and historical character. And this is not to be understood as a kind of metaphysical a priori, but the essence of human genus is to be divided, or is to be defined historically as the social production of the genus. And so it's only revealed through this dialectical naturalism by which the human genus constitutes itself. So within this, I think we're talking about like the transformation of our own external nature via metabolic exchange, which involves the making of all sort of, like in the case of nature, making all objects into sort of inorganic nature, but precisely in a way that maintains their separateness from the human genus. And then this conceptual armature that kind of underlies the idea of metabolic exchange with nature. Marx provides us with this idea of the inorganic nature of the human genus as a kind of lens or a medium through which that metabolic exchange is mediated. So it's not really a form of us dominating or controlling nature, but it's better understood as a kind of transformation of nature by way of technique. So the human genus itself is transformed in the process of like its metabolic exchange with non-human nature, but I think also we like have like a kind of internal transformation, right? So human beings and like apply this to themselves, and so I think we can also understand like social relations and institutions in terms of this idea of social metabolism also. And I would say that because we can think of this transformation as like a transformation of the development of the human genus and so on. We can also think of, this is a kind of transformation of like that takes human life and its productive forces, its social forms and institutions, etc., as like objects for our own determination. I think one thing that is like, one last thing that I want to say about this is that Marx's kind of idea here also involves like a reduction of like, or his critique of the alienation of genus being, and is that it involves a reduction of the external nature of the object to like the domination, like to be understood as, I'm skipping over a little bit, so I got a bit mixed up there. One thing that I think is really important about Marx's critique of alienation is that it takes this kind of like social metabolism to be like a natural given, and in this way it sort of makes it intractable to like the things that human beings might be able to do to like transform it. So like I think it's precisely because of this false understanding of the natural givenness of relations that characterize justice in its current form that needs to be transformed. And indeed, which also like presents the sort of primary obstacle to any material transformation of those relations and a society characterized by them. So essentially what I want to say here is that the idea of social metabolism, understood as the taking of human genus being as an object for consciousness, as a second nature, involves the unmasking of these systems, not as naturally given dependencies, but as systems which we bring into existence and which are characterized by laws that govern our own self-subjugation. So the political project of transformative justice is the project of emancipation from this reified naturalism of human sociality. And it's not merely the presentation of a normative argument for the transformation of institutions to which a corrective measure is presumed to be imminent, but rather an attempt to circumscribe a kind of activity that confronts justice as something malleable and apt for transformation. And it's similarly, therefore, not to understand the project of transformation to have some kind of fixed and ideal state wherein it can be finally satisfied, but instead to see it as this kind of open-ended process whereby, like in even sort of a revolutionary context, we're continually confronting our conception and institutions of justice in ever new ways. So I'm almost finished. I just had a couple of, my sort of concluding section was to like talk a little bit about open questions. So I think that there are still like quite a few challenges to the practical realization of this project that I am trying to spell out here, which, I think that they're open-ended, but I think they're not really unproductive. I think they are productive challenges. And I'll try and present them in a sort of scattershot way without getting bogged down in the detail, as I know it's already been quite a bit. So firstly, I think that there are real questions that need to be addressed in terms of the forms of authority that we imagine to mete out any kind of justice at a level that extends beyond the communal. So as I've been trying to suggest here, like juridical conventions can in a sense be seen as both metabolizing social relations as well as metabolizing sort of legal norms themselves. However, in pretty much all contemporary societies, justice is administered in a strictly hierarchical way, such that we cannot really say that a society administers a law unto itself, much as one class subjects the other to its juridical protocols under the pretense of like a theoretically sound legitimacy. So the challenge here is twofold. Firstly, we have to ask how a society that does not in any real sense know how to administer a law unto itself can somehow develop the capacity to do so. And then in the second instance, how exactly the mode of governance of a society might need to be transformed in such a way that it's both practically able to discharge the functions of justice in a way that express, the genuine needs and objectives of that society, and at the same time is recognized as a legitimate form of authority. So whereas these, these are quite slightly more straightforward questions, in the communitarian context, because we can sort of figure out like things like whether people consent to something or not, or like whether they affirm a sort of form of governance. Like in the case of society, this is like, you know, always mediated in some way, and then this question of mediation is kind of quite important. So that's actually kind of the second issue or problem that needs to be addressed. Firstly, in the sense that our picture always needs to include like, okay, so like, first of all, we need to include that there will be communities, and then there's like this question of generalizing and scaling up that can't be conceived as a sort of full deprecation of those kind of social structures. So this is why I actually suggested that cover reading. And I think it was Dennis was saying in the chat that it can be thought of in terms of narratives. And I also, I think this is really interesting. And I was even thinking more along the lines of like the fact that just like these communities have some really practical infrastructures that subtend like this kind of narrative that they have as like enclaves within a broader social reality. So then when it comes to questions of justice, infamously like social communities constituted by things like crime syndicates, right? Like they like to deal with things in-house. And this is both subtended by like a powerful narrative, and then perhaps also by more sort of powerful practices that are justified and rationalized by this narrative, which has a functional role in relation to them. So I think it's a virtue of the cover paper that it deals with less extreme cases and in some really useful ways also thinks about the dynamic between these smaller and more intimate social worlds and the larger systems that exercise a more general jurisdiction over them. I think this highlights the central question in terms of like, when we try to think about a more general jurisdiction of juridical power that encompasses more abstract and dispersed forms of social relations, how does that in some way fit within our existing world, in which we have these already established and very distinct communities. And I think it's quite obvious that in many cases, we won't be able to like impose anything onto them by way of juridical principle, but perhaps also to the extent that we understand part of the history of the development of these like communal sort of enclaves and their narratives and infrastructures as a way of those communities differentiating themselves from the predominant modes of state and sort of like international judiciary. We might imagine these models of justice as a transformative, we might imagine that models of justice grounded in a transformative paradigm provoke some very different sort of reactions, some of which might be better and some might be worse. And so beyond this, we also need to think about like more or decomposed aggregates in society. The fact that like, as soon as we begin to aggregate people in ways that are not very decisively constituted by such a community, we also lose a degree of resolution in terms of understanding what people's needs and desires are. And this is important when it comes down to the sort of meat of transformative justice, because transformative justice itself also has to have like this kind of reciprocal element, right? So we're always trying to get inputs that inform institutions and processes, and how we deal with this is kind of like, you know, it's complicated by the fact that when we're dealing with social like compositions, it's got like a kind of mediated character, I guess. So finally, I think that there's also a need to think deeply about how the social compact at the levels of society is more abstract than at the level of community. And this is something that I feel does have a relatively strong bearing upon the extent to which transformative justice protocols are accepted as legitimate and valid, and in particular in the sense in which people tend to understand the role of justice in ensuring things like security and cooperation within a society. So this is really just a matter of saying that in a community, you most likely know who the subject of the transformative justice process is, or like subjects. And in this knowledge of that person means that you're likely not to be relying as much upon the sort of process itself to function as a sort of overseer, or you don't have to like relate to it in the sense of like a big other or something, if I'm understanding correctly how this term is used. So when we talk about this on a social level, we need to refer more to the structures that govern social exchange in ways that are not so directly tractable to the individual member of that society, either in the sense that who or and what agency discharges that function is relatively alien, and also to whom justice is meted out is something more abstract. The very simple case in which we see this play out in contemporary societies is with things like xenophobia, right? And like fear of the alien other, fear of the criminal as kind of like a type, and the associated paranoias around that. So in the first instance, when there is obviously like a question of political buy-in that needs to be addressed, but then I think we can also render this problem at a more fundamental level of understanding that the prevailing sort of punitive and carceral models of justice at the social level don't take that particular form accidentally, but rather they satisfy a set of needs. And I think it's not such an easy thing to overturn. So in a sense, when we talk about the social compact at the level of society, it is not only something abstract, but also something often seen as something that cannot fail, but only ever be failed. And in this, this is kind of a function of the kind of power that legal and juridical norms often exercise to satisfy the psychic needs and the pathologies of classes, national identities, races, etc., that those inevitably represent. So really, when we're talking about the social compact at this level, it is also something that applies to different people in different ways. It's absolutely not a sort of contract in which all parties are conceived equally, despite whatever theoretical justification is given to the contrary. I think one really significant problem we do need to get to grips here with is the fact that often legal and juridical norms and conventions in a given society presume this kind of closure or attempted closure of contingency. The laws having this kind of like dominating character addresses a very kind of primal social anxiety that people can do things that don't follow some rational or predictable order, and thereby fundamentally disrupt your own personal security or comfort or way of life. And I think it's a key feature of transformative justice that it seeks to reject this repressive function of the law, because it's grounded in this more productive transformative character and not in this kind of excluded middle judgment character that identifies individuals as like threatening or non-threatening. It doesn't really premise itself on this promise of like an eventual elimination of the difference or a final resolution of like human psychology and psychopathology, nor of like social dissonance. And in this sense, I think like Adorno has quite a lot to offer us, right? Like in terms of thinking this sort of final repression of society and by the absolute kind of domination of that which is not identical to itself is an ultimately totalitarian project. It's no coincidence that the far right often positions itself in this sense as the custodians of law and order that continually like raises alarm over a criminal element in society, which is both a paranoid fantasy and also something with, you know, a real basis insofar as like we don't always want to say that like society is curable like to the fullest degree or whatever. Like transformative justice in a sense like never promises to deliver on this. And so yeah, the objective isn't to just like cure all social ills and so on. Okay, I've been going on for too long. I think this is kind of mostly what I wanted to talk about, and maybe I'll just finish here and leave some space for questions. So thanks to everyone for bearing with me. I'm sorry it might have been a little bit messy in places.
Yeah, perhaps we should take 5 minutes before we go to questions. I think it was Rafael's suggestion. Right, just okay.
Glass of water. So my apologies. I think that was like a little bit too long for a presentation, and yeah, I hope it was still okay for people. But
Well, I'm not one who to complain because I mean I have absolutely no credibility to complain about those things.
I got really excited by the topic, and then I ended up having way too much to say.
I was
So-
even gonna say if you don't, I mean, if you wrote so much, don't you could share. I mean, if you're up for it, you could share it. I mean, so we can get a feel for the other parts. I mean, a lot of it sounded already so well concatenated that, you know, and like put together that I'm not sure if you're planning on publishing it or something.
No, I just wanted to like talk about it, but yeah, maybe I should try and put it together in a more sort of cogent, like written form, and then yeah, maybe I could share that as well.
Is everyone back already? I think half hour is back. I think it's okay. Not sure if anyone wants to ask first.
If no one else has something, I can just go first. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about Cartani for a second because and maybe this is a confusion on my part too, because I don't not exactly sure about everything he's written about justice on the mode A level, but to me, I always associated Cartani's view of mode A as like it's almost like a unstable form of justice because like I don't associate it with something like restorative justice. I associate it with things like blood feuds and honor killings and like a kind of a retribution that is very unstable. So I just wanted to, because you had mentioned, you know, trying to reimagine these practices of restorative or transformative justice at a community level and then reimagine it as scaling it up and kind of maybe depersonalizing, if that we could use that term, but taking the individual out of the equation a little more and talking about it more at transforming institutions and the nomos itself. But anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to bring that up, that I don't really associate mode A with this project, right? I don't see it as inherently mode A, but if you do, like, I wonder what might lead you to think that.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry.
Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was also a bit tentative on this, but I can say what my intuition was, which is like, I guess I was thinking more in terms of like what is the mechanism through which these kinds of like practices as they are currently in practice, what is the mechanism through which they have some form of like legitimacy or kind of appeal. And I guess maybe this might be me misunderstanding it slightly, but the reason I'm thinking about it in terms of like mode A is like, yes, I think that these kind of like things like blood feuds or like sort of like more unstable things are part of that too, but maybe it could also be understood like in the sense of, you know, I guess like you like the mode in which the kind of like people are compelled to buy in, or the mode through which like people are, or the way in which people sort of kind of see their sort of the consequences of their participation or non-participation is like mostly at the level of like very sort of reciprocal exchanges, or like, yeah, more sort of like, yeah, like smaller scale communities. And I'm thinking in particular, like where he talks about like how, you know, if you become isolated from this sort of community that you're part of, that's kind of tantamount to like a really, you know, you're kind of being like exiled from a form of life in a sense. And so that was kind of the intuition that I was trying to appeal to. And interestingly, like with transformative practices, you know, I would say that like there's a tendency to sort of like kind of avoid this sort of like uncomfortableness, because like it's kind of that, but it's not only that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe like there was a lot of stuff that I had to cut out for reasons of time that sort of maybe went into this in a little bit more detail. But that's like fundamentally how I'm understanding it. It's to do with this fact of like things like, yeah, exile, things like being excluded from a community and so on, seem like currently to be the modes or the sort of way in which yeah, like things like transformative justice processes tend to work and be effective. Maybe that doesn't, hopefully that answers at least where I'm coming from with it.
My question is a kind of follow-up on what Dennis asked, because I was reading up on the topic beforehand. I mean, I clearly know absolutely nothing. I read like one of Ruth Morris's text on transformative justice. I read the cover text you sent, and I went to see the connections between him and Schmidt, which you then mentioned today, that there is kind of a Schmittian presupposition. And then sorry, just to clear up, Michael, I think that restorative justice is one of the things that is being criticized by transformative justice, that it's kind of a halfway idea, right? I'm not sure, but just to go straight to my question, like from the way you presented it, which I think puts the problem in a really interesting way, because everyone I managed to read a bit on, and like I could see that it takes very different strands going all the way up to kind of a more kind of, you know, Black feminist theory of care. There are people like what's her name, Adrienne. Yeah, and like, which is a totally different thing, but the common feature in a lot of it is that to move to a structural theory of accountability, so to move beyond the idea of harm between victim and perpetrator, and to move beyond the idea of, you know, emancipatory justice as a return to some past condition. So to accept that, you know, ultimately there is nothing but moving forward. So if you want to do something, you need to transform. The stage is always the community. So the larger frame of accountability in this transformed sense of is the community. But then what I wonder what you think about this. So it's that the funny thing is that I guess what helps to solve Dennis's question is, why is the concept of community here a type of reciprocity that doesn't sound like, let's say, the basic logic of mode A, which is very unstable. So vengeance usually is the logic of, you know, you do something to me, I do twice to you, I don't do the same, right? And I think that Schmidt is a really crucial mediator there, because there is a theory of community that was born with the nation state, and it's already mode A seen through the prism of mode B. And I think Schmidt is the ideologue of, let's say, retrospectively reading, say, mode A under mode B and projecting it into a sort of metaphysics of friends and enemies. And anthropology is there to criticize him pretty much. I mean, if there's one thing about reciprocity in anthropology, is that it is not just about friends and enemies, right? It is unstable. And the whole thing, that it's funny because the fact that Schmidt starts with a critique of legal indeterminacy and how do you build legal legitimacy out of it, and that this involves violence, the choice of indeterminacy is a very interesting term because it's precisely something which is not a problem for most community building in the history of mankind. It's all about putting things in category A, B, or some weird hybrid thing we nobody knows how to explain, but you live with it somehow, right? So the first thing that I wanted to hear you speak about is there are problems of scaling which might not come just from mode A itself, but by the fact that once communities are only recognized to be what this kind of B plus A thing, right? This kind of Schmittian community of friends and enemies. Once you define communities like that, they're not scalable. You either have small communities of affinity or you have nation states. And this would be my first comment, which is in practice, you do get mode A on a higher dimension already because you have communities, law, international law, and then geopolitics where nations decide based on power if they are going to follow the law or not, right? So we do get higher level of community, which is nation, but it is the same Schmittian restrained community, which is nation state, right? It's community for the state. So the first thing is I wonder how much gain, even in terms of scalability, but also just in terms of intelligibility of what's going on, we gain by separating reciprocity, mode A, and community building from the restraints of community as it appears to the state, because those two things don't seem to align. So that could be like a lateral move, right? And then there's the move that I think you're focusing on, which is, well, it still might be the case that we still need to think what is justice that has a broader structural sense of accountability, which is not communitarian, even in this amplified sense, right? So I think those two things seem to connect. And I wanted to see how you think about this. I don't even know if it's a common feature that this Schmittian background is the frame for thinking communities in most of these projects. And then the second thing I just wanted to hear you a bit more on is the group you're part of. It's called Care and Justice Work Group.
Well, so I'm part of a political organization, sort of now more peripherally because it's based in the UK and I don't live in the UK anymore. So I'm part of an organization called Plan C, and then within Plan C, I'm part of a working group that it's called Care and Justice. And yeah, I mean, this is like how I see, I think how I've inherited something that brings these two topics very closely together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because then I wanted to hear like what usually these processes of trying to bring transformative justice into situations, I imagine they involve like facilitators, conflict resolution, some negotiation with the state, but going beyond it. Like, just wanted to hear a bit more about how these things get kind of mobilized, you know? So yeah, those are the two things I was thinking about.
Yeah, so I might have to like reprise the first question because I'm sort of like not sure in 100% like if I understand what you're asking, but I can definitely maybe start with the second one and then I can attempt to answer the first one. So just in terms of like where the like how the practical stuff works. I mean, originally the group was set up in a way that it was mostly meant to deal with any sort of allegation of like wrongdoing or abuse that was like either like basically that had some kind of connection to the organization. So it might have been that somebody did something to somebody else, or it might have been that something happened to somebody, and then like what kind of sort of was necessary and what is necessary to address these sorts of things really depends on the nature of the case. So like in some case that I'm working on at the moment, it's enough for like two of us to kind of facilitate yeah, like basically a kind of a process and you know, it's this process is actually sort of like, I mean, increasingly like the sort of work that we've been doing now, it's, you know, with people with like who kind of are in our broader ecology but not part of our organization and so on. So like, yeah, it can really take on like a lot of different forms, but that was kind of how it began, I guess. yeah, I mean, it's like normally it's a case of like people bring stuff and say like, you know, we kind of always make ourselves available if people have stuff to bring, and then we discuss whether we can take stuff on, and then like what, you know, we start from questions of like capacity, like, okay, how many people do we need to be able to do this, and then how do we have like people in reserve and so on, and then we try and get the details, and like, yeah, I mean, like I don't know whether that's like your question is about like how stuff actually happens practically, or whether it's all scope of the kind of like, because I think this is also an interesting question, like there is a kind of increase in the scope of what counts under this, which also like motivates some of my thinking about like how do we broaden the scope of justice in general. I mean, like, you know, I don't want to, I'm not going to talk about any sort of details of any cases just for like sake of like confidentiality or whatever, but like you know, there's been like cases of like where the thing that needs to be done, or one of the major things that needs to be done, is that like you need to talk with an organization about their internal structure and governance and like how they organize themselves. Or there's been cases where like, you know, there's like a political contradiction involved. It's not really like there's maybe some kind of like personal, interpersonal kind of conflict, but it doesn't constitute like an abuse of some kind, but there's like maybe a political contradiction involved. So, I mean, maybe one thing that I can say, and like this doesn't really reveal anything about anybody involved, is you know, there was a case of somebody that basically two opposing sides in a dispute that were on opposing sides of a picket line, right, and part of the same organization, right, like, and this is a political contradiction, and there was like certain kind of you know, interpersonal stuff that also needed to be resolved, but the main thing that we were addressing was that political contradiction. And yeah, so in terms of the scope, it can be those kind of things. Obviously the main big one that kind of motivated this to start was like usually forms of like, you know, abuse, sexual abuse, this kind of stuff as well, which are like the really involved cases that we need like quite a few people and like a lot of time and a lot of, yeah.
That text that was published on Plan C about building communities of resistance, it's in that context.
Yeah, I think this one is actually not through, I'm not sure if this one is through our group or not, like, because I know that there's also like stuff where people have gone off independently using the same thought and who are members of Plan C, but they've just like applied it in a different context. So there's like a 7 or 8 part text, which is not work that our group has specifically been involved in, but people in the organization have. And then there's like more recently, there's like another one. I mean, the website's a bit of a mess at the moment, so it's like I don't know what people are reading there. But yeah, this is definitely like, yeah, it's part of the same thing.
But you know, just to go on that, like it's interesting that it has an internal, inward facing function as well in politics, because it makes sense that where would you find mode D, right, if not in socialist, communist, anti-fascist organizations, right? So it makes sense that it might be like something you can prefigurate or start from inside organizations rather than outside. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, which is exactly like, you know, this is like maybe like the gestation period of what I am thinking about is kind of like its broader sort of revolutionary import, right? But this is also like for me where the critique begins, not as a kind of undermining of the practices, but more as like now being in the midst of that, it brings up questions of like what needs to be done in order for this to like transcend its current limitations, right? So you know, but then I think, yeah, definitely like within a political organization, that always is like a good catalyst to kind of to sort of, yeah, commence those kinds of questions and like that kind of line of inquiry. So I'm kind of trying to understand what your first question was about. And if I understand it correctly, you're saying that there's like, well, and I understand the bit maybe about like the Schmidt part about kind of mode B, like being a kind of like the sort of a reprisal of mode A, or like mode B kind of like in the form of the nation sort of generalizes these kind of like unstable mode A relations. But yeah, are you kind of just asking if this is just sort of like a different sort of higher dimensionality of like the community thing that I haven't sort of considered, that maybe
I'm just curious. I'm just curious because it appeared in other places, or like Michael is here, we were in his work, I know this is appearing as well, this kind of double movement of moving beyond community, which would say move from A to D, right? But there's also the issue of uncoupling A from the way that mode A is efficient under B and C, meaning there is a type of, for example, I'll put it very practically. Let's say, if individuals are already workers, citizens, and therefore property owners, and in a certain sense, you generalize the idea of property, the idea of wrong and harm and accountability, even if it spreads to the community, it will have to spread to a kind of recognizable group that has an inside and an outside, and true individuals, because they form the basic unit of those things. But that's not, let's say, the general theory of community. That's the form it takes under nation states. It's a historically specific form. So you can decouple it by going upwards and seeing its own problems with scalability, because it's true, like if everyone to arrange themselves in higher and higher groups need to always match as their insides and outsides, it won't work. It's almost unscalable. The state will mediate these two levels and keep them separate. And there's also the lateral move. And I wonder how relevant that is to transformative justice, of saying, yeah, but the very idea of community we're working with is part of the problem, almost as if the state suppresses community, invents its own form of like a legitimate community, and then it tries to sort the problems it created itself, you know? And because it seems to have to do with a lot with Schmidt as an ideologue of, you know, what the community is, but he's an ideologue of a community under historically specific form.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have anything like general to say about this. Like, I definitely think, yeah, I mean, I mean, I would say, yeah, I mean, I would have to think about it more, actually. It's just something that I mentioned in the reading, or sorry, in the research, but yeah. Yeah, I guess I'll just have to think about this one, because I don't, yeah.
No, we'll do it together, because I have no idea either.
Yeah, I mean, my brain's running on a little bit of like low battery mode as well, I think. So I'll probably have an answer for you tomorrow. Maybe I can like.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good thing to start a conversation. This is, I mean, I think this goes to the core of a lot of people's research. I mean, I'm not sure if anyone wants to follow up.
I mean, maybe there's also things that people were not clear on, because I think I wasn't super clear about some things. So if anyone has stuff that also just clarification, like that would be, I'd be happy to do my best.
Yeah, I could ask another one, which is on the topic of metabolism again. I didn't fully understand the way that you connected that to the beginning and the end of the talk. So just wondering if you could just reiterate how metabolism fits in. Are you saying like we should try to consider metabolism also in the context of the nomos, or as a kind of a shared resource? Because that's something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of justice as the ability to share or produce shared resources, right? Because anytime you have this need for an intervention or mediation, you kind of have to go to somewhere, right? You need to go somewhere to get that resolved. And so that's like a shared resource that is, so yeah, I don't know, any thoughts on that and the connection to resources of nature and the metabolism with nature? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, okay, yeah, I mean, I did also suspect that this part might be like a little bit unclear when I was going through it. So like, I guess I'm glad that you also brought it up. So, I mean, I was also kind of like a bit tentative on my understanding of this. So like, the way that I was understanding it was, you know, like you think about the way in which human beings sort of like, and well, I mean, I think about this through Marx, the way that human species being is in a sense, or human genus being is kind of like constituted by the way in which it sort of has these kind of like exchanges with nature, right? And I was thinking of like applying this also to like, or I guess like this also to some degree, it does, like it's there in Marx as well, applies to the way in which there's a kind of like exchange process between like, yeah, us as sort of like political agents or human sort of as a kind of like human societies is like producing and like the sort of externalized like institutions and the product of sort of like yeah, this kind of human production. And so that was kind of like the reason that I was trying to use the word metabolism. Like in a sense, it's kind of these sort of like institutions are a consequence of us trying to like you know, like of society's sort of yeah, like reproducing itself in a sense. And so I'm not sure actually, like I'm kind of interested in terms of like how that does connect to collective resource. Like I sort of have a general kind of, maybe I like from what you were saying, like an idea. I mean, in terms of like, obviously I think questions of justice are connected in a sense to like questions of distribution and questions of like also allocation of like resource or whatever, and like also like philosophy of right as somehow connected to like yeah, like participation in that. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I made that specific kind of connection that you're bringing up now. I don't know, like, is this in any way like illuminating for you, or like, have I understood properly what you were asking?
Yeah, for sure. It's really illuminating for me. I mean, I think it opens up a lot of questions more than like answers anything in particular. I think the question of how we should conceive of, like, when you say transformative justice, it's not so much about, you know, righting some kind of perceived harm, although that's included in it, but it has to do with the overall like reproduction of society, right? So like, how do we want society to move forward given that there are harms? You know, you can create basically an economic system of an eye for an eye, where you basically evaluate everything and you're like, okay, this type of violence has this type of cost, and we as a society agree on that cost, and that's how we regulate harms, right? So we restore, right, to use that word, we restore the violence with some other type of payment, which is like ultimately an economic viewpoint towards reproduction. But then what you're putting forward, it's very interesting, because it's not about finding one measurement or one mapping of harms to payback, but it's about like you know, somehow like intrinsically exploring what society can be, right? How the both the perpetrator and the victim can move forward, and also society itself, right? So I don't know, there's something there that's related to a lot of stuff we've talked about in SDP, like the concept of like an ultra filter, which we talked about really early on, which is like this idea that there's whether there can be one kind of general equivalent for in the context of exchange, right? You have like general equivalents for commodity, but also like you can have the same question when it comes to justice. Like, is there a general equivalent for paying back a harm that you do to someone else? And I feel like your project or the thing you're putting forward, transformative justice, is to say that there are such things as like a non-principle ultra filter, like to use that fancy jargon, or when it comes to like violence done to one another. Like there's something that isn't like a general equivalent. But yeah, I don't know. This is just some ideas that you've sparked in me. But thank you so much for the presentation. It's been very interesting.
Thanks also for that comment. That's like also like got me thinking. This is a really good way of putting a lot of that stuff. I don't know this concept of the ultra filter. I don't think I've read that far back in the sort of annals of STP. So maybe that's also some like a useful concept. I mean, just like one really quick thing also like to say is I know I made a bit of a deal about like kind of making a distinction between like transformative and restorative justice, and I think like you really captured this well in terms of like what like why for me there's kind of this kind of this is not something that I think, I mean, maybe it even comes back to the fact that like I'm kind of coming at this almost from the perspective of practice more than of literature, and I'm not really that well read. Like I've read some very sort of foundational texts or whatever, but probably a lot of this stuff is like and I know I need to like go back and read some more of the literature to like even just kind of understand it for myself better. But like a lot of it for me, it's just been like informed by kind of collective discussion and practice and reflection on that. So so the upshot of that is just that like I don't know whether like other people within the sort of world of transformative justice have the same kind of like opinion about this term restorative justice as I do, but I do understand restorative justice to be like this kind of older political philosophy also, and one which does like presuppose this notion of restoration, right? Which I guess like again it comes back to this idea of like a kind of equivalent or a sort of like a presupposed sort of like unity or kind of state of balance, right? That I think needs to itself be called into question, or like that I think transformative justice outcomes are always relative to a kind of like we determine what is just relative in many ways, not all ways, but in many ways to like what kind of transformative sort of process is recommended, right? Like how do we redress something in ways that also address its underlying conditions and improve that sort of existing sort of reality that gave rise to these sort of problems. More concretely, like we're not just trying to like understand what a person did wrong that led to them like harming another person, but also how do we sort of address that person in a way that like can stop that from happening again. And I think maybe like restorative justice has a similar idea, but I think that the advantage of the transformative kind of framing is that it doesn't presuppose some kind of neutral state to which there's a kind of restoration taking place or whatever. Maybe that's just like me reading too much into the way that the concept is called, but I think that there's something in this. Did you have any question?
Yeah, I just wanted to also ask something, because from my understood, Robert Cover's text is pretty relevant as a kind of foundational text on the problem of trying to manage the limits of just the application of law, what he calls the imperial or world-maintaining justice, right? I mean, I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but I understood that he gives this definition of kind of the experience of the law as being something fundamental, which is where you have norms and a narrative, right? And then he says, well, the world creating experience of the norms, which is like unity-based, meaning-based. You don't do things because there is meaning to why those things are not to be done or why they should be reacted to in a certain way. And then he gives that explanation that, well, but then you need the imperial kind of layer, which is world maintaining, because the world creating thing is kind of too small, perhaps. I'm not even sure why he gives some biblical examples of why following that can lead to problems. And then you have the addition of the world maintaining kind of more powerful, kind of law infusing, kind of enforcing approach, which again, I think for me, it's kind of the Schmittian mythology, which is, communities left to their own devices, they go crazy. They can't really afford, they'll go into mayhem. And yes, it's violent to apply the law, but it's kind of what else, right? So of course, he's much more progressive than Schmitt, but that mythology is kind of there. But the interesting thing is that he associates moving back to community, or let's say changing the emphasis between world creating and world maintaining on the narrative, right? And I think that that's a really good way of seeing where what you're saying doesn't fit into that, because there is a tension between complexity and narrative, right? And I just thought sort of giving this example because it's the practical example I have from work. I've worked with groups of mothers who lost their kids to gun shoots, right? I'm not sure, shootings with the police or between drug factions in Rio. And the paradox that we're constantly trying to understand in this field is that there was this transformative idea. We use that a lot. There's a strong abolitionist movement in Brazil, reparations movement in Brazil. And one of the ideas in that movement is to include the perpetrator and the victim in a narrative. But once you get systemic racism into the picture, the moment you start to understand that the moment that a lot of these mothers meet the policeman who actually fired the gun, or the kid who got arrested for shooting at the other person, that's when they become depressive. Like until then, they were melancholic, they were kind of blocked in their grief. But the moment that you present this particular cause, which allows you to create a narrative, like this person woke up, went to work, he's a policeman, he was in a gun shooting, and then he shot your kid. That narrative doesn't cover the actual causal structure, because the actual causal structure involves impersonal structures. Especially, I mean, there is a correlation between this reparative situation happening, victims meeting their the perpetrators of the crime, and this falling apart when the race of the policeman was also Black, because then there is a gap between the structure, the causal reasons, and who actually perpetrated. It becomes clear that he probably lives in a community nearby. He's not a rich person. He's not in a different life. He's not really the cause from where the shot was fired, so to speak. And you get this break, because you would have to include a level of complexity that you can't really put into a linear narrative anymore. So I think that that's a really good example. I'm not sure, I imagine there is kind of stuff to address this, but in like the practice of this that I've seen, this is a place where you can clearly see that just by stitching together in the same world, even if it's a matter for the person to be the policeman to be transformed by that encounter, it's still not addressing something. Even if you add the whole community, and even if you add the police department, it would still not touch on something which has to do with this very impersonal reasons of why the police was there to begin with, or why the cost of firing a gun for a policeman in Rio is so low that he wouldn't go to jail or anything anyway, right? Why would it be treated like a war zone, which is how it's treated to begin with, if it's the same population? So the moment that the encounter happens, that's when the break happens, because then it's obvious that the structure is of a different scale, you know? So I think that it's very interesting that the way you're putting it, and then when now remembering the text, it's clear that that approach, that initial, more original approach to the problem, cannot really, like those terms cannot account for this type of problem, I think, right? And I think that for you know, gender violence and racial violence especially, but then if we go to economic violence, which is even hard to treat as violence to begin with, right? You get like these layers of added complexity that already show that you couldn't even frame the problem as a narrative problem that a community now shares, and the narrative distributes new model of accountability. It only works for very specific things that could fit into where causes and effect can fit into that kind of common strata, you know. Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to. It's a classic. I have a question, but it's more like a comment kind of thing.
For the comments at this point, because I'm really starting to sort of flag energy wise. So I've really enjoyed like hearing that and like trying to think about this problematic, because yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's even like something that was implicit, but maybe that I want to think about more explicitly in what I've presented in terms of like you know, I'm thinking about the question of transformative justice, like maybe more as a question of like, yeah, how do you transform institutions and so on, but then yeah, like going back to this idea of narrative more, yeah, like then thinking about even the individual experience vis-a-vis like the sort of structural conditions and the way that kind of narrative gets sort of like, yeah, like obviates or kind of like obscures this in certain kind of ways, or like is an insufficient understanding that like sort of can address some of like the underlying psychological needs, and so like that kind of stuff is yeah, it's like something that I hadn't really fully considered, even though like it was there in the reading, but it's like a really interesting and like I would say like an additionally really fruitful angle to consider all of this stuff.
Yeah, because I mean, I perhaps there's a practical consequence to this, which is it ties together the possibility of creating a narrative with the organization that makes that structure intelligible through the Trinitarian thing, you know, that we often discuss. Like, then it makes sense. Why is it that it's in a political anti-fascist kind of radical organization that this would appear as a necessary form of, you know, a necessary theory of justice? Because you need a theory of justice that kind of how would I put it? It will have to create a correlation between the levels of structure you can make real. So now they become real things you can talk about, and then the narratives you can create for world creating in that sense, right? They're not a given; they are conditioned by that organization. So if you manage to create an organization that is able to influence, you know, wages, there's probably a reparative kind of I wouldn't say legal, but a consequence for the level of care, because now you can construct a narrative that will connect economic structures and the harm that's done to you, right? So it perhaps it can even turn care into the name of that kind of resonance, you know. If you manage to turn certain things intelligible, and because you can interact with them, they became, let's say, actual entities in the world of that organization. It takes care to adjust narratives and, let's say, rebuild communities at the level of that set of things that now you can say to exist, right? I think that a good counterfactual, kind of good inverse or negative hypothesis is, if you are a trade unionist fighting for better wages because you already organize your political view, as in these things, I can interact with them through the trade union, through strikes and so on. It's weirdly incoherent and even pathological to narrate your own economic harms, the suffering or the prejudices that happen at an individual level. Now you have the means to address them. You know, it happens to me because it's part of this bigger thing, right? So I don't know, it seems to offer that kind of point of connection. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sorry, I was going to say something gone in my head. Yeah, I mean, I think just in a very basic sense, like, again, this is like another really interesting connection in terms of like, obviously, like transformative justice does involve like these questions of like, how like subjects themselves are being reconstituted. So then like thinking about it with respect to like these kind of like structural questions and like how politicized subjects are kind of can adopt these kind of like more like structurally sensitive perspectives maybe, and like through this kind of this way of understanding justice is also like it's pretty much it's pretty like relevant, important, I don't know.
You know, it even gives a new sense to the word justice. I'm not sure if you can use that in English to say that it's adequately matched. Like in Portuguese, you have justeza, which means like something that fits you perfectly is justo. Like it, you know, for example, when you say the punishment fits the crime, justice can be used to mean that fitness, you know, it's a just fit, like it's a proper kind of
one thing, like, or
yeah, right. And I mean, if suddenly you're talking about justice in the sense that you need to adapt organizations so that they're exactly as you said. I think this is a really good term, like structurally sensitive, right? That's a like very concrete operational meaning of justice, where if people are being harmed by certain structures, you need structures that are sensitive to that harm, so that it can be just in the sense of, you know, to match the level of the thing that's being done, right? It's very, very interesting.
Which is, again, like this comes back to like these questions of like, there are just like, and maybe, like I didn't go into enough examples on this, but like, I definitely think that we are looking at, like much broader harms than are addressable at that level of community, and which is why like, but I don't know how it becomes realized in like a set of practices, or I think that these are like open questions that, you know, need to be like resolved in political practice and in like developing theory and practice of like, organizations, but also kind of, you know, social institutions and so on. But I mean, I don't know how to like get down from the level of abstraction on that one. I think there's like more thinking through that needs to be done in order to sort of get it from that level of abstraction to something concrete, because, you know, I still, I think even it's like a difficult thing with like coming at this from a perspective of like practice that your imaginary tends to even be constrained by like the fact that you have very concrete cases, right, that you're dealing with, and so you conceive of things in those terms, and it's like both an advantage, but then like almost like harder to like see how that very real practice that you personally are engaged in has this kind of more general sort of abstract dimension that can be but I think that again, it's like a productive challenge, right?
Definitely. No, this is so interesting, man. Yeah, my brain is melting too, but it was so good.
I think I'm gonna have to take off soon because I can feel my voice going, and
no, I think, I mean, I'm not sure if anyone has another question. Otherwise, I mean,
around maybe another 15 minutes or so most, but yeah.
I guess everyone's brain is melting anyway, so perhaps it's a common thing.
Yeah, it's a tall order, no? Like 2.5 hours of chatting. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Look, but I mean, I think everyone would benefit if you're up for just sharing some version of what you wrote down. And of course, it's just for internal circulation, but I know Fernanda, who had to leave, she was often talking about how we could bring more discussions on state and law into this. So I'm sure we could like plan more stuff on it for the future, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd be really happy to do that. And like I say, I think it needs a bit of refinement to be presentable in the form of a text, because like, you know, I have it as a text for me to read, which involves lots of things that anyway, but that's definitely something I'd be really happy to do. And like, also to hear like what others are kind of what other angles, because I think this has been like really interesting for me as well, and fruitful, and exactly what I was kind of hoping to sort of achieve with this, which was like sort of, you know, I really don't want to see my sort of relationship to STP also as a kind of like extractive thing, but it has been really fruitful for me to think through some of the practical work that I'm doing through this kind of like these frameworks that STP have been providing. So like that's also like really helpful in this kind of broader arc of like other political projects that I'm involved in as well. So thanks everyone for like the comments and the questions, and like I probably have to also revisit some of them in the recording later.
Great. Okay, I think if no one has another question, we could try to save the little bit of brain for the rest of the night. And thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. And thanks for having me for the presentation as well. Cheers.
Great, guys. See you all then.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Take care.